I just started asking friends, hey, can I go to church with you and check it out? So in a succession of 3 Sundays, the first week I went with my good friend to the Serbian Orthodox Cathedral in Chicago, which was awesome. And it was actually Christmas, Orthodox Christmas. Nothing was in English. It was all in Old Church Slavonic or Serbian. It was 3 hours, all standing, incense, a choir hidden in heaven somewhere singing over us with these booming basses, and the iconostasis, and an icon of Christ the Pantocrator like a mile above us. And it was funny because I'm like, if I could fully understand what was happening here, this would be amazing. Because it felt amazing, even with the language barriers and everything. So I went with him, and most of what didn't call me back there was just cultural. You know, I wasn't Serbian, but it was a great experience. I think my mind was saying, if you could translate this into my heart language, this is what I'm looking for. Just walking in somewhere and being completely immersed in something so much bigger than myself. You know, I felt like I was walking into something that was happening, like almost like eternally happening. And again, the only drawback for me was just it was outside my culture and language and all of that. But yeah, I mean, everything about that resonated. And then the next week, I visited another church with friends. It was okay. And then the third week, I went with some friends to the Episcopal church, some college friends. And I'll never forget this experience. I didn't even really know how to pronounce Episcopal when they were telling me, like, okay, I'll go with you because you're my friends. And as soon as it started and there was the liturgy, I was like, I think this is a translation of what I experienced 2 weeks ago, which it was. And the most powerful moment for me was when the Eucharistic prayer started. Hearing how much God loved me and where I fit into God's plan throughout history and heart for the world, and just God's larger heart for the world. And in the canon of the Eucharist, hearing the depths of how far Jesus was willing to go to communicate God's love, I bawled through the entire Eucharistic prayer the first time I heard it. I mean, just like ugly crying. I was so blown away. And it was as if everything I had been reading in the Gospels for the last year and a half leading up to that, it was like being incarnated in the context of a worship service. And again, it was that very similar experience I had had 2 weeks prior of like, I am walking into something that is already happening. Like, it's happening, it just almost like the liturgy. It almost feels like it's happening in the context of eternity. Like, it doesn't start and stop. I just felt like I am showing up in an event that is so much bigger than myself. It's so much bigger than Downers Grove, Illinois, where I lived and grew up. It's so much bigger than the scope of history, and yet it's like right here. And I walked into it.
I think some of the more mystical takes on what the liturgy is focuses on that, right? When the liturgy starts, when you go into church where a liturgy is taking place, you are going into a different time.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't have that language at 20 years old, but in hindsight, I mean, what I was feeling are things like what Alexander Schmemann describes, to your point, and other believers and theologians about what the liturgy is. And so the Eucharistic prayer ends. I am just completely torn asunder by the love of God that was expressed in it. And then they say all baptized Christians are welcome to come participate in this. And that was it. I was home. I've been an Episcopalian ever since that moment. So, hearkening to a conversation that you and I had when we were both feeling the weight of all kinds of things, you had just said, thank God for the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. So, why do you say that, and why do you still say it?
Because I think that I think one of the biggest challenges that Christianity has is this issue of being an ancient religion like you're talking about. How does it fit into a secular, technologically advanced culture? And that is a big deal. That is a big problem. Modernity has not been kind to Christianity, I think. That's why we have so much, every year we see drop off in church attendance and things like that. And generally over this last century, Christianity in general is sort of dropping off, at least in the United States and the Western world. And I think we can understand that as this difficulty in how does this church fit in this modern world. I see basically three approaches that churches take. One is to simply reject it, right? Just retreat into a fundamentalism that just decides that it's not going to accept things that are fact because it doesn't seem to jive with what they want. And I think you lose out on that. And the other way of dealing with it is to go in the opposite extreme, and that is sort of downplay the ancient parts and change the ancient parts and change Christianity to fit in with the modern world. But I think the middle way, and that's a concept that gets associated with Anglicanism anyway, that middle way is the path that the Episcopal Church has taken, and that is to simply dedicate themselves to holding on to both, making them work together. It understands that, in a sense, all truth is God's truth, and that's how our theology should work within the modern world. So, in one sense, I'm an Episcopalian because here I can have the ancient faith that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I can have the creeds, but I also have all of the great things that come with the modern world, all the learning that I'm so invested in as a historian. When I talk about the modern world, I'm talking about not only science, but I'm talking about new ways of understanding the past, new ways or better ways of understanding humans and motivation, new ways of studying documents and getting at the past, and more sophisticated ways to look at texts, and including the Bible. One of the things that the Episcopal Church embraces is higher criticism, which is a product of a far more sophisticated way of getting at the words and getting at what the authors were talking about, and finding what those authors meant outside of the things that might have bogged them down as far as their culture is concerned.
Yeah.
The Episcopal Church, again, realizes that all truth, if it's true, it belongs to God.
Yeah.
So there's no reason to reject things that are true. And in fact, if we look throughout history, and I think the Episcopal Church understands this, is that when theology is when theology collaborates with those things that on the surface seem to contradict it, mm-hmm. it produces a deeper and richer and more beautiful faith, more deeper theology.
Yeah.
So I think that another reason to say thank God for the Episcopal Church is that there are a lot of people who their churches have made the faith completely irrelevant because they've rejected certain things that those people know to be true, or that they've been rejected because their particular church thinks that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas the Episcopal Church has combined its ancient wisdom with the modern world and has found this wonderful place where we have both.
Yeah.
Right? We have those things you described, and we also are able to engage in the world as thoughtful people. And I think uniquely we find that here.
Yeah, I agree.
There's that middle way. It's a hard way. I think it's the most difficult of those positions. It's easy to make mistakes. But I think the result is what we have, and that is a robust theology that is reflective of the universal nature of the gospel. It's for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think we're uniquely aware of that in the Episcopal Church.
Well, the point that you made about the middle way being the more difficult way, I think it takes courage to stand in the tense places, where maybe there is a question, where the church has always thought one way about something, but now is being challenged with some new information to think, and needs to have the courage to make it right. And that's one of the things that I see in the Episcopal Church that we have a willingness to do is to kind of have the courage to step into the difficult places, the difficult conversations, to even live in the tension of some uncertainty sometimes. And I feel like that's one of our inheritances is to do the courageous thing that is difficult, to live in tension for the good of the whole, to not say it's black or white, it's this or that.
Yes, and I think that when I'm talking about with the notion of having a certain attitude toward the modern world, I think that is why we get what you're describing.
I think one of the other things I feel the longer I'm in the Episcopal Church, just as a member, and especially as a priest, is that I thank God for the Episcopal Church for is that I have found people from very different backgrounds and experiences who were ready to give up on the church, and in some cases ready to give up on Christianity because of bad experience, or ways they were wounded, or ways they were told they were an outsider. And to see their delight when they find us, or we bring it to them, which would be even better, and realize that the church as they've understood it, all the robust pieces about ancient Christianity are fully intact, but some of those things that have wounded them are not part of us. And the way I've heard some people express it is like, oh, you guys really do the Mass. You really celebrate the calendar. And my response to them is, a lot of them come out of Roman Catholic backgrounds and say, yeah, we're Catholic. We're just not Roman Catholic. Or if people are coming out of some, other church backgrounds where they've been wounded, to just show them that, look, the church, as you can experience, is something that has always been happening, that you can step into. You don't have to muster it up and perform for it to happen. It's something you participate in. And that's one of the things I'm thankful for is, if you're going to minister to people in Jesus' name, I can't think of a better place to do that from, because I have the foundation of the historic church to stand upon, and ancient Christianity to stand upon, and all the freedom to meet people where they're at and speak their heart language the best I can with God's help, and they have the freedom to experience it.
In other words, to love.
Yeah, exactly. Just to love people, and to love with no asterisk on that. And I think, the thing is that it could sound like that we don't call people to step outside of themselves, or maybe that we don't call people to challenge themselves to grow in their walk with God, or challenge themselves to grow in their ability to love others. We do. I think when we're immersing ourselves, in things like Lent, for example, but also when things are happening in the community or in our world, and we use the intellectual resources God has gifted us with to read the gospel and see how Jesus might be calling us to respond to something that happens, or feel about something that happens, or support the people who are going through it. That gives us the freedom to love really well. We have the freedom to bring us, our intellectual resources to the reading of the Gospels, so we can actually love people better, and not parrot to them theology that's always, existed right, wrong, or indifferent. One of the most healing things that I'm privileged to see regularly is, particularly in small group Bible studies, both the ones that I've led, and especially when my wife Tammy is leading them, is to see the healing that washes over people when we walk through a Bible passage where, for example, Jesus is showing incredible dignity to the most vulnerable, or incredible dignity to an outsider. I think of passages like the woman with the issue of blood, where he just looks at her and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace," when she is pushing up against every cultural taboo just to touch the hem of his robe. The Roman centurion who says, "Lord, I'm not even worthy to have you come under my roof. Just say it, I get how it works." And here he is, a Gentile, pagan, occupying army, enemy. And Jesus looks at someone like that and says, "I haven't found you that great a faith in even in all of Israel."
Yeah, that breaks so much down. Like you said, it breaks down borders, it breaks down gender, it breaks down nationality, which of course is the whole purpose of raising up love as the guiding sort of the guiding force and the guiding principle. Yeah. So thank God for the Episcopal Church.
Yeah. To me, the Book of Common Prayer is the greatest Christian discipleship tool, to use a churchy word. It's one of the greatest tools for mentoring people in the faith and helping them live their faith, second only to the Bible, at least in English, in my opinion. And I think, even in this day and age where people aren't carrying a prayer book around, when the kind of faith we are forming them with are those tools in the prayer book, it helps them anchor themselves to that thing that is always happening, and they can walk into it like I experienced and still do. It anchors them to, for example, we're in the season of Advent, the Magnificat. The fact that it's normative within our tradition in the daily office to be praying the Magnificat, the words of Mary, and to be anchored both to something that Christians have prayed daily for 2,000 years as our own act of worship, but almost being pulled back through history right to, here are some of the most revolutionary words ever spoken in history, and also some of the most incredible psalmody or poetry of praise offered to God by a teenage girl presented with something impossible who was the first person to say yes to Jesus. And like, that's morning prayer. In our tradition, those pieces, and that we can form people with them, certainly the Eucharist and the church calendar, that whether I'm feeling it or not, the church says, hey, it's time to stop and create some margin in your life because it's Lent. And you need to slow down and build some margin so you can hear the voice of God and, let go of the stuff that is not your best, and let go of the sins you have against God. Let go of the sins and crummy attitudes you have towards your neighbor. And I'm not always ready for that. And yet the church lovingly says, hey, we're all going to do it together. And I'm grateful to have that foundation to stand on. I'm glad I don't have to make up every week in and out what the life of God's people ought to be. The church does that for us.